So this particular lecture focuses on the nervous system. We do not go into great detail, but it is important to just have a basic understanding of some of the terminology and the way that it works. So the first point here, Roman numeral number 1, is how the nervous system is organized and is broadly separated or categorized rather into the peripheral nervous system and the central nervous system. Let me go ahead and use the annotation feature here. The central nervous, of course, there's the brain and there's the spinal cord. And then I've also included something here, even though there's really kind of part of the brain or the spinal cord, cranial nerves. So these are nerves that actually arise within the central nervous system, and then they exit out and go to some different places in the body and are responsible for different things. Most of the muscles in my face, some in my neck, my swallowing function. So a lot of the things isolated to the head are supplied by cranial nerves. They're not supplied by nerves that come from the spinal cord. But there's also nerves that actually will go down the spinal cord and then go out to places like the heart, the lungs, the kidney, and other locations, the digestive system. And they will actually then, of course, make things happen, but they actually start in the brain. They never connect anywhere else, and they go all the way out. That's a cranial nerve, so it starts in the brain. The peripheral nervous system, you can see here, all nervous tissue found outside the central nervous system. Because there's a lot of nervous tissue that's not in the CNS. We have peripheral nerves, we have receptors, we have things that pick up information, take it back to the central nervous system, or information that even may come from the central nervous system, but it didn't arise in the brain and go all the way. In other words, it's going to actually connect somewhere else first. And so these nerves, the peripheral nerves, will come into the spinal cord and go out from the spinal cord, but it says they may synapse or connect with another neuron in the central nervous system. Well, just some information here about how this is then separated out a little bit further. In the peripheral nervous system, we separate information into motor information and sensory information. So motor information, that's the outgoing information. It is going to make something happen. And again, we more broadly separate that into a somatic motor. So this goes to skeletal muscle. Incidentally, it can also go to skin. It's considered that as well. But we don't have a lot of motor information going to skin, if you will. We do have a lot of sensory information. And it says that this decreases with age. This goes back to what we talked about with skeletal muscle, that pretty much everything slows down with age. The nerve signal, everything coming out to the muscle, well, that includes this somatic motor information as well. The other part of the motor system is the autonomic nervous system, which can also be included with sensory, but I've put it here because of the information going out on the autonomic nervous system. So this is not the information going into muscle. It's the things that we're usually not aware of, going to blood vessels, the bladder, the digestive system, and so forth. And we'll talk about that separately in just a moment under Roman numeral 2. And then, of course, we have sensory information that's coming in from the peripheral nervous system, and we also categorize that into somatic and visceral. Okay? And the somatic sensory information is from the skin and muscles. And the reason that this is classified together is because this is information that we're usually aware of. We get information from the skin about temperature, pressure, touch, tickle, itch, all kinds of different things. We pick up that information from the skin. Muscles you may not be aware of, but if you think, usually, even if your arm is in a certain position, you can't see with your eyes, you can tell that your arm is in that position. We have information, the muscles pick up information so that our brains are aware of where our body position is, where things are located, what is the angle of the joint, and so forth. And that way we are aware of things. We may not be as actively aware as we would say, but like with the skin, but we're certainly cognizant of that. Whereas visceral sensory information, this is information from the internal organs. You never know a thing about it. It sends information back to the brain makes adjustments and sends it back out, autonomic, right? And so that's all taken care of. So now let's go down to the autonomic nervous system here. I'll slowly erase that. So this is primarily, even though it can include the sensory information, we usually talk about it when it's motor information. And this goes to smooth muscle and to glands, and it's because it's going to make things happen in the smooth muscle and glands. I should also point out it's actually cardiac muscle as well. It's just not smooth muscle because it does go to the heart. And if anyone's ever taken any kind of a psychology course, you ought to know this information right here. That autonomic nervous system we break down into the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions. And sympathetic is fight or flight. So think of anything that gears you up for activity. That's sympathetic. Parasympathetic are things that gear you up for resting and digesting. And I always like to point out, this does not mean that we excite everything, and parasympathetic does not mean that we slow everything down. Because with fight or flight, we will dilate some blood vessels, like to the muscles, the lungs, whereas we will constrict others because we need to just deliver the oxygenated blood to the things that are where it's needed. In parasympathetic nervous system, we would dilate blood vessels to the stomach, to the digestive tract, but we would actually decrease it to the muscles. And so don't think of it as exciting or relaxing, because with rest and digest, it excites the digestive system. And so it's, again, not an excitement and relaxation. It's a fight or flight, and it's a rest and digest. Well, now how are signals then carried in the nervous system? That's the next little section here on signal transduction. And I've indicated parts of a neuron. And I am going to attempt to draw these using my mouse. And so if this is the main part of a neuron, this is the cell body, okay? Then there are little parts that come out off the cell body. It's kind of like this bad hair day. These are the dendrites, okay? And this is where the neuron primarily receives signals, not only, but primarily. And then another part of the neuron is this long process that kind of sticks out from it right here, ends in this little bulb. That is the axon. That's where the electrical signals get passed down the neuron. So the signals are received here initially at the dendrites, they'll kind of come across the body, and then this section, this area right here, will determine whether the signal is going to go all the way down. Once it's started, it's going to go all the way down. It's never going to stop, and that signal is going to reach the end of the axon. This part down here is known as the synaptic knob, and it probably joins with another neuron over here. So here's some more dendrites for another neuron. It's passing the signal onto those. And then that other neuron would pick up that signal, and it would transmit it. Perhaps, because sometimes in neurons will inhibit another neuron. It can be very complex. All right, so the part that I just pointed out right here, that is the synapse. Okay, and I've defined it as where a neuron connects with a target. Usually that target is another neuron, but it could be skeletal muscle, it could be smooth muscle, because when you're delivering a signal somewhere, it's going to have to end on an organ somewhere. And the signal gets passed from the end of the first neuron. I'll draw it like this. And here's the second neuron right here. And that signal is passed via a neurotransmitter. And many students will be familiar with that. So it releases a chemical that diffuses across, binds to the receptors on the dendrites over here, and can initiate a signal or inhibit a signal in the subsequent second neuron. Note the point here, this slows down with age. And so cognitive processes, thinking things through, reacting to problems, trying to learn how to play the piano. Nothing is quite the same, and everything would be just a little bit slower. All right, so this next section is just to talk about some very, very basic brain anatomy. We're just going to talk about a few parts of the brain. The cerebrum, and I know in your psychology classes you go through frontal lobe, temporal lobe, parietal lobe. occipital lobe. Those are all part of the cerebrum. Okay? And I've just grouped them together. This is where higher order thinking occurs. The part that really makes us human and a little bit different from other animals. We process our sensory information, comes in, we plan our movements, and that information all goes out. And importantly, in the parts that relate a little bit more to this class, are some of these different parts of the brain. The hippocampus. This is the first part of the brain that is typically affected by Alzheimer's disease, and that's a part that's responsible for memory. And I should also add emotion on there as well. And if anyone has known anyone with Alzheimer's disease where their memories are initially affected, a lot of times their emotions are affected as well. And that part is generally not thought about because it's the memory part that really impedes in quality of life and activities of daily living. Another part of the cerebrum would be the epithalamus. This is where the pineal gland is located. And I mentioned this because we're going to have a student-led instruction on circadian rhythms. And the pineal gland is not the only place, mind you, but that's really kind of where circadian rhythms end up primarily getting controlled. There's some input from other areas as well, including the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus does a lot of different functions. And the way that I like to think of it, and I did not get this from a textbook, but really through my own study, I used to study the hypothalamus as a postdoctoral fellow, and for its role in regulating food intake. The hypothalamus is really the master integrator. It receives information on all kinds of processes in the body and then sends out information. It may not directly go and control that, but it's going to influence somewhere else in the brain that might control it. So the hypothalamus kind of has its hand in a lot of different functions, including hormonal regulation. It secretes and regulates many different hormones. In fact, if you've ever gone through endocrinology, many of our hormones from other organs are actually controlled by hormones released from the hypothalamus. And so it's kind of a master integrator in a number of different ways. The hypothalamus is also involved with primitive functions, and I call it that because things like sex drive comes from the hypothalamus. And if you think primitive, well, what is necessary for life? Well, you need to reproduce, you need to eat, you need to drink. So food intake, although again, it's not the only area of the brain that does that. Intake of fluids, regulating fluids, releasing hormones related to fluids and fluid balance, control of blood pressure, control of blood glucose levels, any number of things that are going to relate to just keeping yourself alive and keeping your species alive. The hypothalamus is directly connected to the pituitary gland. It's actually kind of like this, where here's the hypothalamus up here, and then there's this little stalk called the infundibulum, and it connects to the pituitary gland down below. And I'll kind of draw it like this. There's kind of two lobes. Kind of an awkward drawing here for you, but here's the hypothalamus, and here's the pituitary gland right here. Well, this pituitary gland is considered to be the master regulator of hormonal control. So when I said a lot of these hormones come from the hypothalamus, it's that those hormones from the hypothalamus actually then regulate hormones at the pituitary gland, which then regulates other hormones in the body. So the pituitary gland is the master regulator. Finally, we have the thalamus. The thalamus is kind of right in the center of a lot of things. It's where the spinal cord comes up. It kind of ends at the thalamus. Then the thalamus spreads to and sends signals out to all areas of the brain. So any information coming out from the brain, going down the spinal cord, any information coming up the spinal cord and into the brain pretty much passes through the thalamus. So the thalamus is really a major relay center. And it contains an area of the brain known as the basal ganglia, which is actually involved with coordinating and smoothing movements. And so it can be important as we age if it's not functioning properly. Right, the next area of the brain, the cerebellum. This is kind of a cauliflower-shaped structure at the back of the brain, And even though there's only one thing listed here, this is really important. It coordinates movement. But if you stop and think about all of the things that are necessary to coordinate movement, you need to get input from your body, you need to get input from your eyes, you need to get input from your inner ear where you sense balance, you need to get input from your motor cortex and the cerebrum, which is planning all of your movements. And it has to add all of these things together to help keep your movements well coordinated. Learned movements are often regulated in the cerebellum, so you can repeat that movement over and over and over. Right, finally, I have the brainstem listed here, and there are some different parts of the brainstem. If you've learned them before, you'll recognize like medulla oblongata and the pons. But in general, what these areas do is they control many of the different organs. Think of digestive tract, think of heart, think of breathing with your lungs, and it's regulating those things. So underneath the brainstem there, I have breathing, cardiovascular control, swallowing reflex. These are all regulated at the brainstem level. So I mentioned that neurotransmitters are the chemicals that are released from one neuron, cross the synapse, and then act on another neuron or on some type of a target organ. And I've just listed a few common ones here. The first one, acetylcholine. This is the primary hormone for parasympathetic neurons. It's also found in other areas throughout the brain, including the hippocampus, and is one of those that's affected by Alzheimer's disease. Norepinephrine, which is generally associated with sympathetic neurons, and the fight or flight response. We also have dopamine and serotonin, which can be involved with learning, memory, emotion, and a variety of different things. And are often dysregulated in mental disorders or mental illnesses. So finally, I just have a little separate section here indicating drugs that affect the nervous system. And I go through this for several reasons. One is the older you get, the more medications you take. And the more that those medications affect you. Excuse me. Well, that means it might be nice just to be a little bit aware. Plus, if anyone is ever going to the medical profession, people are on these, how do they affect the people? I thought it would be worth it to go through and give just a little bit of information about this. So the first category here, note it says sympathomimetics. In other words, they mimic the sympathetic nervous system. They give a fight or flight type of response. They may not give a whole body fight or flight response. It might be a local response, and I'll explain that in a minute. One common drug that is a sympathomimetic is albuterol. And if anyone has asthma, you probably have an albuterol inhaler. This is typically the short-acting rescue inhaler that you take if you're feeling a little bit wheezy. There are also longer-acting albuterols. Well, albuterol you usually take by breathing it in through an inhaler, and what it does is it will dilate the smooth, or cause the smooth muscle in the bronchioles to relax, so the bronchioles will dilate, which can increase airflow. And that's how albuterol works. Well, anyone who's taken albuterol probably has felt that sometimes they take albuterol and it's like they feel their heart speed up. This goes back to sympathetic nervous system. Remember, sympathetic nervous system is fight or flight. In fight or flight, you want to dilate the bronchioles. You want to get more air in, and that's what albuterol is doing. But some of that albuterol also spills over into the blood and can act on another subtype of receptor in the heart, where it can actually cause you to have an increased heart rate, because that's also part of fight or flight, is having an increased heart rate. And so that can happen. And at least in my experience, if you use, and not just use the inhaler, but you have the little tube that you put it in and then breathe in, that actually gets more of it into the lungs and less of it gets into left in the mouth, where it can be absorbed into the bloodstream and go to the heart. And so I actually have fewer problems with the use of a spacer is the name of that little tube. All right, the next drug here I have is Sudafed. Many of you have probably taken this as well. Sudafed, what it does is that it actually will constrict arteries in the nasal passages. Again, a sympathetic response because you don't need to dilate arteries in the nasal passages when you're trying to run away from a bear and climb a tree. And so those arteries can actually be constricted, arterioles actually, because they're the ones that control blood flow. And that's what Sudafed does. Of course, it can also have body-wide responses. It can keep you awake. In fact, it does keep me awake. But again, that's part of the fight or flight response. Sometimes this is a few college students' favorite drug of choice, caffeine. Staying awake through class when studying. I'm not suggesting that you do that. I just know that that's been many students' way that they have made it through. Caffeine actually has a number of different actions. And one of the ways that it actually keeps you awake is that it activates what are called adenosine receptors, and those are some receptors in the area of the brain that help to keep you alert. But in general, caffeine is a phosphodiesterase inhibitor. Now, don't get scared by a big word like this. Roman numeral 2 here tells you what phosphodiesterases do. They break down the signaling molecules from sympathetic stimulation. So if you think about norepinephrine, and you are that's the fight or flight, and you've stimulated with norepinephrine, that actually creates some intracellular signals, and phosphodiesterase actually helps to stop phosphodiesterase, yes, helps to stop those signals. Well, caffeine inhibits phosphodiesterase, so that allows more of these sympathetic signals, and we're talking inside the cell. And so that's the effect of caffeine. Nicotine is a sympathomimetic. Incidentally, nicotine can also activate parasympathetic nervous system, and it can do one or the other predominantly, and it varies a little bit from individual to individual, but generally it is believed that nicotine is more of a sympathomimetic, and it binds to certain acetylcholine receptor. In fact, this should be B here, binds, and not F, finds. And I can actually fix that right now. There's binds to specific acetylcholine receptors. Note that caffeine, I didn't say anything about addiction. Caffeine can be addictive, but it's mildly so. Some individuals more than others. But nicotine, strongly addictive. Yeah, again, some people don't get addicted, but the reality is in most humans, it can be a strongly addictive drug. But nicotine can activate all these receptors that increase heart rate, increase blood pressure, and that's the effect of nicotine. Note so far that only albuterol up top is actually a prescription drug. Sudafed you can buy over the counter, although you do have to go up to the pharmacy window because the pseudoephedrine that is in Sudafed can actually also be used to make methamphetamine, and therefore it is at least regulated, but you don't have to have a prescription. So if we scroll down here to amphetamines, these are of course a drug of choice for many people, and now we're talking about more illegal, but there are some of these that are used clinically. And so we have amphetamines can do two different things. They can block reuptake of dopamine, and that can actually help with mood and some different things. They also block reuptake of norepinephrine. And what we're saying by reuptake is those neurotransmitters will stay around a little bit longer. They won't be taken back into the cells again. And of course, one of the problems with amphetamines is that they can be highly addictive. It varies. There's a whole bunch of different types of amphetamines. The last one I have here in the sympathomimetics is cocaine, which of course is not a prescription drug and is certainly not legal. They have the same action as the amphetamines, so they're blocking reuptake of certain neurotransmitters, and it can be highly addictive. And in my postdoctoral work, I actually learned that cocaine also remodels brain pathways, and so it can be a very dangerous drug. All right, our next category here are lytics or lytics. This word right here, to lyse, means to break down. So when you analyze something, you're breaking it down and thinking about it. And so these are kind of blocking the sympathetic nervous system, if you will. And so we have just three here, some adrenergic receptor blockers. So an adrenergic receptor is the one that norepinephrine binds to. And so if the sympatholytic is bound to the receptor, the norepinephrine cannot bind. And in that way, it blocks the sympathetic action. And those can be broken into two types. And that's because there's different subtypes of receptors. We can have the alpha blockers, which are a little bit more commonly used in something like blood pressure control, or beta blockers, which can also be used for blood pressure, but are also used if somebody has elevated heart rate, or if they might have a variety of different illnesses at the same time. There are side effects of beta blockers. They can make you tired, they can make you lose sex drive. But again, all of that would be associated with their blockage, really, of sympathetic nervous system. All right, a few more categories here. We've got sedatives, okay, things that make you sleepy. And what they do is they actually block specific receptors, right? They calm people down by blocking those receptors. Opiates, I'm sorry, I misspoke. Opiates, let me pronounce it correctly. These are, of course, used to block transmission of pain. And there are different levels of opiates, and this is just a few of them here. These aren't all of the prescription drugs. These are the traditional opiates, if you will. With the lowest level, there's morphine, then codeine, heroin, OxyContin. These are all opiates. And of course, they can also be addictive, which is one of the problems with them. People become addicted to the drug, and so they want it, even though they maybe don't have to have it for the pain. Other common drugs, antipsychotics. And here's something that might be interesting to you. There's many antipsychotics that work really well on the market, but we don't have a good handle on how they work. And that's because there's so many different neurotransmitters in so many different areas of the brain that in humans, it can be really difficult to know exactly how that antipsychotic is working. But many of the antipsychotics actually activate dopamine receptors. There are some that will do serotonin receptors, and they can work in a variety of different ways. But we don't know a lot about their actual mechanism of action. And antipsychotics are used for something like schizophrenia, bipolar disorder perhaps, sometimes even depression if they can't find anything else that works very well. But the reality is that there are many antipsychotics that actually have weight gain as a side effect. And so a lot of people don't like to take them even if they are effective. So our last category here, antidepressants. I've only put two categories here, and this last blocker uptake right here, this should actually, let's put it over, that should be under the tricyclics. Not quite sure why it's not working right, but we'll make sure that you get the right information here. So monoamine oxidase inhibitors, what these do is they keep dopamine and norepinephrine from being broken down. And they can actually help to improve mood as a result of that. There can be side effects if they're used with other medicines. And so it's always important to be aware of what those interactions are. The other category of antidepressants are the tricyclics. And rather than blocking the breakdown, they're blocking the reuptake of norepinephrine, dopamine, or serotonin so that they're around for a longer period of time. And so this describes how the tricyclics work.